Which of the following is not in the domain of secant of x? Well, you can think of secant as 1 over cosine, and then something in the domain, something that's not in the domain should be something that would cause a divide by 0 problem. So when does cosine of x equal 0? Those are the ones we want to exclude. Those are the ones that can't be in the domain. Cosine are the y coordinates on the unit circle. This is like 1 comma 0. Sorry, whoa. Cosine are the x coordinates. I'm very sorry. I just did a video on sine. I think that's why I said that. Cosine is the x coordinate. So cosine of 0 degrees is 1. Cosine of 90 degrees, or in other words, cosine of pi over 2 is 0 because the x coordinate is 0. So do we have pi over 2? No. Look, pi over 4 is somewhere around here. That cosine is not 0, right? If we keep rotating, this would be negative 1 on the x. We're looking for where cosine equals 0. This would be 0 on the x. So cosine would be 0 here. So what do we got? That's pi. That's 3 pi over 2 to get here. Is 3 pi over 2 on our list? No. So we said pi over 2, that would cause us to divide by 0, 3 pi over 2. But what if you rotate in a negative direction, like negative 3 pi over 2? It's negative pi over 2, negative 2 pi over 2, negative 3 pi over 2. That brings us to a place where cosine would be 0. Pi over 4 we said lands here, so that's not 0. Negative pi, that would bring you to negative 1 comma 0, so cosine would be negative 1 there. Negative 2 pi over 3, that's somewhere in between two dots. That means cosine's not going to be 0 there. And negative 2 pi, that's a full 360 rotation. Cosine would be 1 for negative 2 pi. So there's only one value here that is not in the domain of a secant of x. This one's a little trickier than the previous problem we just saw, because it's tempting to just say, look for those excluded values, and if they aren't there, then they should all be positive. But try plugging them in. Negative 2.1, plug that in for f of x. And then you could use your calculator if your calculator has a secant function, and if it doesn't, you could just rewrite it as cosine. But the way you'd use your calculator is you'd say arc secant of negative 2.1 equals x. That's how you would undo secant of x. That's how you get the secant away from the x. Can't divide both sides by secant, okay? So if you go in your calculator, you hit 2.1 negative, and then go to trig, and I have to hit secant. That's arc secant. Secant with the negative 1 in the superscript position. It's kind of confusing notation, isn't it? But that's a possible value. Let's do the next one, 0.8. If we do the same steps, we're going to need to do arc secant. That's an invalid input, so that one is not possible. So we can check this one off. 0.17. Let's see if that is possible. That one's invalid, so we're going to exclude that value. 1.23. Hit trig, arc secant. That's possible. And then 2.18. Trig, arc secant. That one's also possible. The other way of doing this is you could look at the graph of secant of x and see when you can reach these y values. And you see it will never reach y equals negative 0.8. Never reach y equals 0.17. I guess another more analytical way is to rewrite that as 1 over cosine of x and solve that equation for each y value. You'll see there's some values like here. Let's do this one. If you plug negative 0.8 in for f of x and rewrite this as cosine of x, we know the function cosine of x is between negative 1 and positive 1. You're going to use that fact in calculus a few times. Okay? Because the amplitude is 1. There's no number in front of cosine of x. So it fluctuates between 1 and negative 1. If I solve this equation, I multiply both sides by cosine of x. And then if I divide both sides by negative 0.8, I get cosine x equals 1 divided by negative 0.8, or in other words, cosine of x equals negative 1.25, which isn't possible, right? Because of the amplitude. The amplitude's 1. It's not gonna go beyond negative 1 on going to the left. So that's why this one's not possible. One last one for this type. Which of the following values of x will cosine of x equal secant of x? Well, let's rewrite that equation. Secant is just the reciprocal of cosine, And if I multiply cosine to both sides, I get cosine squared x equals 1. Or if I take a square root, cosine of x equals positive or negative 1, right? Because if you take a square root of both sides, square root of 1 is 1, but we got to consider both the positive and negative values. And so when is cosine going to equal 1 or negative 1? That's what this equation says. That's when these two will be equal. So what angle will make cosine equal 1 or negative 1? Cosine's the x-coordinates, so an angle of 0 does the job, or an angle of 180, an angle of negative pi or pi will work. So 0, pi, and those are the only options that would get us a negative 1 or 1 for the x-coordinates. Because again, the x-coordinates are the cosine values on the unit circle.